that we're going to cover. All right, and this is the one case that's really new. This is one of the cases that's really new. So what is it going to be? It's going to be the case of if we have a positive number minus a negative number, or a negative number minus a negative number. Up until this point, we've never subtracted a negative number. We've subtracted numbers, and we've done things with negative numbers, but we've never had a case where we subtracted a negative number. So it's not very difficult. Let's just look at what it would look like. Let's say we had 5 minus a negative 3. So this is what it would look like. You know that you're subtracting something because there's a negative minus sign here, but the quantity that you're subtracting is a negative number. Now, let me ask you a question. So we're subtracting something negative. We already talked about this a lot in this course. A negative number is nothing more than if you don't have that many of something, you actually owe that many to somebody else. So, if I have, 2 markers here, the regular old subtraction from first grade, if I have 2 markers and I say 2 minus 1, well, we know that we have 2 markers to begin with. We take 1 away and we're left with 1 marker left over. That's basic math, right? But if we have 2 markers, let's say, like this, and we subtract a negative number, what does that even mean? Because if I have 2 markers, I know what it means if I subtract markers away. That makes sense. But what if I'm subtracting a negative number of markers? That means I'm not subtracting a real number of markers that I have in front of me. I'm subtracting the amount of markers that you owed me or something like that. It doesn't even make total sense. So it's almost like in the English language, which you're never supposed to do this. You're never supposed to speak like this. We're taught not to speak like this. But what happens if you say something like, okay, if you say, I don't want bananas. I don't want bananas. What does that mean? It means you don't want any bananas. So don't give me any bananas, right? But what if you say, I don't not want any bananas? I don't not want any bananas. Well, the don't and the not, which are both sort of negative statements, they kind of cancel each other out. And so in the end, you really do want bananas in that case. So think about this for a second. This is important. Okay, I don't not want, let's just say pencils. All right? So if someone does not want something, or if someone not want something, when you not want something, it means don't give it to me. But if I don't not want something, then in fact it means you actually do want something. The 2 negatives kind of cancel out. Now we're never supposed to make sentences that look like this. So that's a big no-no. But what I'm trying to say is that a negative statement multiplied here, or sitting next to another negative statement, basically cancels out. And so you have a positive statement. I don't not want any French fries. That doesn't even make any sense, but if you think hard enough about it, I think you can convince yourself that it means I really do want French fries if I say that. Of course, you never would say it that way. So the bottom line, what I'm trying to get at here is if you have a negative and subtracting a negative number, this is basically like a negative statement and a negative statement right next to each other. So anytime you see subtracting a negative like this, you're going to hear this term a lot. It's called add the opposite. So what you're going to end up doing is basically these 2 negative things, they sort of cancel out and you end up with something positive. So the way you would do that is, if you had this guy here, is you would take your pencil literally on your paper and you would, let me change colors. You would put a plus here and a plus here. So you make it 5 plus 3. So this is now 5 plus 3, and that's equal to 8. So make sure you really understand what I'm trying to say here, because this is something you're going to need to know. Anytime you subtract a negative number, anytime you subtract a negative variable or something like that, if you know it's negative, these 2 negative signs are basically kind of cancel out, just like they do here in the English language. So if you have a negative and you're subtracting a negative number, you're going to end up adding the opposite. So when we say adding the opposite, we put a plus here that means adding the opposite sign from what we had initially. So we put a plus here and a plus here. So it just changes it into something very easy. 5 plus 3. You know how to do that. So let's go ahead and do a few more just to make sure you kind of get it. If you have 6 minus a negative 2, anytime you subtract a negative number, you simply add the opposite. So that's going to be 6 plus 2, which is also 8. Okay? What if you had 3 minus a negative 1? Well, anytime you have subtracting a negative number, you're going to add the opposite. And so this is going to be 3 plus 1 is equal to 4. And what if we had negative 4 minus negative 6? We have subtracting a negative number, we're going to add the opposite. So what we're going to have here is negative 4 plus 6. Now we still have to do this addition, which we've learned in the last section when we're adding integers here. So we're going to basically, because one of them's negative and one of them's positive, we always subtract these guys. So 6 minus 4 is 2, and we're going to take the sign of the larger absolute value, so it's positive. So negative 4 plus 6 is 2. So make sure you understand that. I mean, if you remember back way up here, I told you, anytime you're adding a negative number, it's the same thing as subtraction. That's just a rule you're going to have to remember. You're adding a negative number, it's the same thing as subtracting the number. If you're subtracting a negative number, when you're going to end up adding the opposite, it's basically going to change into a plus sign. And that is just, I've tried to explain it a few different ways so that you kind of understand it, but you're just essentially going to have to memorize that. But don't stare at the video until you memorize it. Just work these problems. Play the section back 2 or 3 times if you have to after this viewing, and then next time you come through, start pausing the video as you go through and start trying to work them yourself and then see if you're correct. It's the best way to do this. There's no amount of staring in a book that's going to make it simple for you. It's just a matter of doing the problem. So we are going to solidify this just a little bit more with a couple of additional little guys here. What if I had negative 10 minus negative 3? Nothing special. Doesn't matter if there's a negative 10 there or not. If I have these two negatives close to each other, I'm going to add the opposite. And so I'm going to have negative 10 plus 3. And negative 10 plus 3, we talked about this. We're adding two integers. One's negative, one's positive. We always subtract. 10 minus 3 is 7. And the larger integer absolute value is going to take the sign of the answer. So we get negative 7 there. And then one final one before we do our whole bit of practice, negative 5 minus a negative 1. Negative 5 minus negative 1. So again, we have two guys, so we're going to add the opposite. And so we have, in the end, negative 5 plus 1. And so we're adding two integers. One is negative, one's positive, so we subtract them. 5 minus 1 is 4, and the sign is going to come from the larger absolute value. So you have negative 4 for the answer. So if you want to talk about cars, I don't not want a car means I want a car. So that's basically what that amounts to. So let's briefly look over this stuff, and then we'll work a bunch of problems. Positive minus positive. First grade math. If the first number is bigger, you just subtract them, just like you normally do, and you get positive numbers for the answer. That's the subtraction you've always done before. If you have positive minus positive where it's flipped around, where the first one's actually smaller, then you do the exact same thing. You still subtract them. Whatever number is bigger, just go ahead and subtract them, but you're going to have to stick a negative sign on the front because you're going to be going on the other side of 0 there. That's something you'll just have to get used to. So anytime you do see a subtraction of positive numbers, you are going to subtract the numbers, but you'll have to remember what sign to put on the front. And you'll get it with practice. All right. The next case is if you have a negative minus a positive, then basically, a negative minus a positive number, then if you look here, negative 3 minus 4, you're just starting at negative 3 and you're making it even more negative. So you're going to end up adding these numbers together like that and sticking a negative on. And that is also because it can be rewritten exactly like this, plus negative, which is what we did in the last section, right? And the final case is if we have positive minus negative or negative minus negative, anytime you have minus a negative number, you need to add the opposite. And then you just follow the rules that we've been studying in the previous couple of sections. Okay, so that was